Good Tuesday morning to you. On Sunday, we had a lot of great passages. We had a text from Isaiah. We had this fantastic passage from the book of Galatians, Paul's letter to the Galatians. And then we had our gospel in Luke. And if you listen to the service on Sunday, I preached on Luke primarily. But for this week, for the devotional series, I thought it'd be fun to really dive into Galatians. Galatians is one of my favorite letters that Paul writes, and there's so much richness in there about how we ourselves are meant to understand how God's at work in us, how we're supposed to be reflective of how our faith is transforming us, changing us from the inside out. That means that not only the way we think and feel, but how we act on those thoughts and feelings. Faith is supposed to fuse those, is supposed to help us to navigate those things more faithfully. Paul ends his letter with this idea of bearing each other. And there's different points within this note of bearing one another that I want to highlight today. So today specifically, I want to talk about transgressions, sin, right? When Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer, he teaches it two different ways. In the Gospel of Matthew, the way he teaches it is in the midst of the Beatitudes. So he's got this whole group of people, right? 5,000 men plus women and children who are all gathered together to listen to Jesus teach and proclaim. In other parts of the world, this is called a revival, right? When I was in Ethiopia, I was in Shashamene, which is south of Addis, and there's this huge structure that they're in the midst of still building. But there's enough of the walls that are there's enough of the roof space that they are there, that they started holding revivals while they were still building the building. And while they didn't have everything up to code, they had places to sit. So you came in and there were resin chairs, those plastic chairs everywhere within. And it would be a revival period, 3 to 5 days, where everyone would travel into town. So they'd come from the outer regions, they'd travel into town, they'd begin early in the morning singing and praising, and people would wander in and in the, they'd wander out for lunch, and then they wander back in. And there were times when it was appropriate for children to be there, and there were times when it was just the families that were there. There were times when men were being taught to and women were being taught to. This was the gathering space, right? They were called to bear one another. And so Jesus, as he's teaching the Lord's Prayer to those who are gathered in this revival space in the Sermon on the Mount, and what we call the Beatitudes, and carrying on through all of his teachings, he tells them to pray in this way. And what he does in the Gospel of Matthew is he says, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Because the Gospel of Matthew is written to Jews. And for Jews to trespass on one another, to break a boundary, whatever that was a sin. Now, Jesus is going to teach the Lord's Prayer to the disciples in the Gospel of Luke in a different way. He's going to say to them, he's going to be teaching and preaching, and they're going to be watching him, and they're going to say to Jesus, "Master, teach us the way you pray." Many of them had learned from John the Baptist, who they had been following previously. They knew how to pray. There were good Jews in this process. They knew what it was to pray, but they wanted to know specifically the way Jesus prayed. And when Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer in the Gospel of Luke, he says, "Save us from our debtors." Because in a Gentile and Jewish community, to hold a debt against another person was to hold sin against another person. So whether you say trespasses, transgressions, sins, or debts, it's all the same thing. When someone owes us something, we are holding a weight. We are holding a need for repayment. Maybe that's a monetary thing. Maybe that's an emotional thing. Maybe we're seeking that apology. Maybe we're seeking restitution. Whatever we are holding against another person, sins, debts, transgressions, and trespasses, all the same thing. And Paul speaks to that. In chapter 6, at the end of this beautiful letter that he writes to the church in Galatia, he begins in chapter 6, "My friends, if anyone is detected in transgression, you would have received the Spirit. You who have received the Spirit should restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. What's the first step in forgiveness? Meeting each other in gentleness. It's hard, right? When we're emotionally charged, when we're frustrated with life, when we have hurt and anger and all of those things that are mixing up within us, Paul cautions us that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit that has been given to us, compels us to meet each other in gentleness. And if you forget the fruits of the Spirit, they're actually just a few passages, a few texts beforehand at the end of chapter 5, 22 on. You can read the fruits of the Spirit, right? Peace, patience, generous, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are the fruits of the Spirit. And when God pours out his Holy Spirit within us, in, through, and within us, we have those gifts. And so Paul reminds us, if anyone holds a debt, a transgression, a trespass, or a sin, we meet them in gentleness. Take care that you yourself are not tempted. Bear one another's burdens. See, that's the beautiful thing about community. We are never going to get it right. We are never going to get to a place where we can be like, hoo-hoo, our community is so much better than other people. Not by our own actions. What makes our community great is our ability to meet each other in our sin. Our ability to forgive each other, to love each other, to find a way to be in relationship with one another, even when we struggle to even like each other. See, that's the gift of what it means to bear one another when it comes to sin. We are called to fulfill the law of Christ, is what Paul writes. And if you look at the footnotes, if you look at the translation right there, Paul's really referring to the law of Christ that he institutes at the end of John, before he goes to the cross and to the grave and before his resurrection. The greatest command is this: love. That's the reality. Our greatest command is not to make sure everyone follows God's law just perfectly. Our greatest command is not to make sure people are measuring up. Our greatest command is not to watch other people before we watch ourselves. Our greatest command is to love. Love each other, love ourselves. And when that is the guiding force, when our love for ourselves and for one another becomes the foundation, how we live and interact with each other, everything else is secondary. And I find that when love is the foundation, everything else kind of sorts itself out. If you're looking for specifics on how to bear one another in transgressions, if you're wondering, how do I work through that relationship that is really struggling, that issue that I'm really holding on to, well, you can turn back to Matthew 18. Starting in verse 15 on, Matthew 18 is a great example of how we are to meet each other in the sin that we cause against one another. How we are to come to each other, have conversation, if we need to bring some alongside of us, to have that worked out so that there is the opportunity for love to shine through, for healing to happen, and for growth to occur. As we think about how we bear life with one another, today's focus is on sin. It's a focus on the reality that we're all broken. We're all always going to screw it up. But that's not the excuse. That's not just a justification. That's a reality. What we do after that is what matters. How we love each other, how we care for each other, how we forgive each other, how we move forward together. The first couple verses of chapter 6 remind us of the importance of that. And then we're going to get on into the rest of the text tomorrow and Thursday. Have a great Tuesday.